Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this latest Raw Umber online portrait tutorial. In this tutorial I will be drawing a single 1-hour pose. And as you can see, I'll be using white paper for this. And the materials I like to draw with are willow charcoal first of all. And willow charcoal can be quite soft, which is a good thing at the start, but at the end I like to use a little bit of compressed charcoal, specifically this General's charcoal pencil or peel and sketch, also from General's. To blend, I like to use a blending tool, and this can be a stump, a piece of tissue, or I like to use a brush as well, but it can be entirely up to you. And finally, to erase, I like to use a putty rubber. A grey putty rubber is best for this rather than a white one, because it's a little bit more flexible. Now before I start, I'm going to tone the paper using a bit of old willow charcoal. And for this I need to open up the grain. So I'm just using a bit of a sandpaper pad here to just open up the grain of that charcoal. You can see now it's got a bit of texture to it, and this helps the charcoal deposit it onto the paper. Otherwise they can be a little bit scratchy. And I'm just covering the whole paper with a bit of that willow charcoal. Now this can be a little bit textured, so I like to use a bit of a kitchen roll or some tissue or something to just work that charcoal into the paper and get a nice clean base on which to work on. And what I love about this is that I can now divide the paper into 3 tones. I've got the dark of the willow charcoal, the mid-tone of the paper, and finally I can just use the rubber to create highlights. So this is very similar to painting, where you're also putting tones down onto the canvas or the canvas paper. But first I need to actually draw the face, of course, and for this there's 2 ways to go about this. The first thing I always do is look at the middle of the chin to the middle of the forehead and look at the angle of the pose there. In this case there's quite a strong diagonal. And once I've got this diagonal in, this guideline of the direction of the pose, I can either draw in the sphere of the head or the block of the head. It doesn't really matter which one you use whichever you prefer, because ultimately they come down to the same thing. They're really just a way to measure the width versus the height of the pose. So as you can see, if I'm using a block, I'll just be flattening off the sides of that curve, and if I'm using a curve, it's more of a round shape. So it really doesn't matter which one you choose to use, but what is important is to then compare the width of the pose versus the height. And when I measure, I can see on the photograph that the width of the back of her head to the front of her hair is roughly actually the same as her chin to the top of her head. So more or less a square shape. Now this is something that our brains don't actually like. We know that a face should be longer than its wide, so it's going to be hard to convince ourselves that this is actually the case, and this is why measuring is super important. Because what we're trying to learn here is turning off our brain's interpretation of what we see and just train it to actually see the actual measurements rather than interpreting things. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm also going to look for the midpoints of the pose, vertically and horizontally. And I'm going to compare these to the photograph and see if there's anything interesting in those midpoints. As you can see on the photograph, the midway point horizontally is roughly the corners of her eyes. And the midway point vertically is the side of the start of her hair. So this is the way I always go about measuring, because I'm always aware that my brain may try to trick me into seeing something else. So it's really important to always double check what you think you're seeing. The next thing I'm going to look for is the 3/3. So that's bottom of the chin to bottom of the nose to top of the brow, and top of the brow to the top of the forehead. And this is more or less universal. It doesn't always work for everyone, but it's a really good place to start from. Now the final measurement I'm going to look for here is the center line, and this is the line that goes for the middle of the forehead, down the middle of the nose, and then down again to the middle of the chin. And you can see it slowly follows that curvature of the shape of the head. Now if I add another oval shape for the back of the head and connect this up with the jawline, I've already got a nice structured skull shape. So this is a really quick way to get started with the portrait. So working this way I find really useful, because this way we're constructing the head rather than just making it up as we go along. And of course everybody has very similar bone structure. Everybody has a skull, everyone has a jawline, and so we can go from there and then get more specific as we go. The next thing I'm going to do is start breaking this down into more generalized shapes that everybody has, and of course the first one is going to be the eye socket and nose. Now when I divide the center line to the edge of the hair into 3 equal parts on the left, I can see the eye fits in neatly between the two. Now the same thing is true on the other side, but as you can see, because this side is turning away from us, it's a little bit less big, it's a bit foreshortened, but the same measurements still apply. They're just all a little bit closer together. Now once I drop down to imaginary lines from the inner corners of the eyes, I will find the nostrils, and this is actually the start of the base of the nose. And you can see that the bottom of her nose is a bit darker. This is the down plane of the nose, pointing forwards to the tip of the nose there. So in a way, you can imagine that the eye sockets and the nose are connected, because from the bridge of the nose onwards, the bone of the eye socket starts and curves around towards the outer edge of the eye. So often we tend to think as the features as these shapes just floating inside the skull. But it's really useful to think of the underlying structure and how it all connects up, because that really helps with bringing a sense of reality and structure to your portrait. And even though we may not see exactly what's wrong sometimes in a certain portrait, we always know if something isn't quite right. So I always try to emphasize this structure rather than just straight in jump into the details. So below the eyes, we have the cheekbones pointing towards the corners of the mouth, and the mouth area is actually kind of a round area, starting from the bottom of the nose, and then the muscles starting there, round off around the corners of the mouth to the bottom of the mouth and the start of the chin. Now, to find out where the mouth and the chin are situated, I tend to divide the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin into 3 equal parts, with the first line I make being the dividing parting of the lips, and the second line that I make being the start of the chin. Now when I drop a line down from roughly the center of the eye, or maybe a little bit further towards the inner corner of the eye, I can then find that corner of the mouth, and it should be the same on both sides. Now note that just like everything else is connected, the mouth is also connected to the nose. So if we follow the top lip, we can see it reaches upwards towards the middle, where the philtrum connects the mouth to that nose. So these are the features, and they're also the hardest part. And once I'm pretty happy with the way the features all relate to that center line and relate to each other, I can then start adding in the pillar of the neck, and I can have a bit of fun figuring out the flow of the hair on top. And of course, while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. So at the moment we've got a constructed face, but it doesn't much look like her yet. It does look like a face, which I think is always a good start, but it doesn't really look like her. And so what I'm going to do now is go over all of the features and try to start looking at what makes her face her, and I'm going to start adding detail in that way. So let's have a look starting at the nose. When looking at the planes of the nose, we have the big bridge of the nose, which is sort of an arrow shape pointing downwards, then another arrow shape pointing upwards for the lower tip of the nose, and this then connects up to the bottom plane of the nose and nostrils on the side. Now at the moment I'm actually outlining these planes for you to see nice and clearly. But actually in real life, of course, these planes are not as clearly outlined. Instead we need to look at other hints to see these planes of the nose. Now the first hints we can see are the tones of the nose. So for instance, looking at the bottom of the nose, we can see that's a little bit darker. And I'm just sort of ignoring the nostrils for this. But we can still see that the bottom of the nose is a bit darker than the top and the side of the nose. So this shows us that this is the bottom plane of the nose. Now coming back to my three tones at the bottom of the page here, I've got the mid-tone of the paper, the darks of the planes that are going down, but I've also got the highlight that I can put in using the rubber. And when I look at the model's nose, we can see there's a clear highlight where the top plane turns into that side plane. So this is another way we can really see those planes. So instead of using a line to indicate these planes, I'm now using the lighter tones that I can make with the rubber. And this is actually a lot more realistic than an outline. Because of course in real life we don't actually see a line outlining these planes. So this way I can take the drawing to the next level. We can see that the nose starts feeling like it's coming out of the page now. And this is because I'm working in tones rather than in lines. And I'm gonna start first outlining these planes and then using tones to describe these planes in the other features as well. So I'm going to start with the eyeball for this. First finding the corner of the eye on both ends, which should be roughly in line. And then trying to imagine or draw in the eyeball that sits in between those corners of the eyes. The eyebrow sits on top near the top of the eye socket and rounds around the eyeball. And I can make a smaller sphere for the iris looking towards the bottom right. So these are all my structural areas, and now I can start looking at the actual lines on top. So for instance, the top lid follows along the inner corner, then arches over the iris and then drops slowly again to the outer corner. And we can see the fold of the top lid follows the top of the eyeball and follows that same pattern, rising where the iris is located and then going down where the corners of the eyes are. Now the same thing happens for the bottom lid. It is the lowest where the iris is located and then rises near the corners of the eyes. Now, of course, we don't actually see these outlines. So instead of keeping these lines, I'm now going to go in and adjust them using tones. So for instance, the corners of the eyes I can see are really rather bright. So I'm using my rubber here to follow these planes and these tones, using the lines that I made earlier as a guideline. I can also actually see that when I squint, I don't see much in terms of brightness below the top lid. So the top lid is actually casting a shadow over the white of the eye and over the iris. And so I can tone this down very slightly. And then, just like in the nose, in the area where the corner sticks out the most towards us, that's an area where there will be a nice highlight. So I can put one down for the top lid and one for the lower lid. Now this is already starting to look a little bit more 3D than just using the lines, and now I can start adding a few darker accents along the line of the lashes, for instance, and other small parts where I can see the eyes just a bit darker. The same thing with the lights. If I can imagine a plane is sticking out the most towards us, that's where I'm going to put my highlight. Another thing that really helps here is squinting at the image and seeing which parts really jump out as being the lightest, and that's then where I use the rubber to put down the highlight. And the same thing happens on the forehead. We can imagine the forehead's flat near the front and then turns away towards the right. And this is the area where we'll see that highlight. So now I move my attention to the other eye, and it's actually a lot harder because this eye is foreshortened. What this means is that this eye will have the same characteristics as the other eye, but all a lot closer together because this is turning away from us. So I'm looking first at the corners of the eye using the other eye as a guideline, and then try to imagine where the iris and the eyeball should sit. Next, I try to find out the top lid, going from the inner corner, then across towards where the iris should sit, and then down very quickly towards the outer corner. And we can actually barely see the lower lid there. But I tend to use the other eye as my guideline, making sure that both eyes are more or less symmetrical. So even if I don't see a lot in the foreshortened eye, I still know where things should be because I've already drawn the other eye. Next, I can start putting in my tones, just like I did in the first eye, trying to get rid of some of the lines. Now at this point, or any other point, if you see anything that isn't quite right, feel free to make small adjustments there or big adjustments to get the likeness or the structure back in place. And of course, while I'm doing this, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments if you're watching this live, and otherwise I will speak to you in a few moments. So I've drawn the nose and the eyes and the eyebrows, and now I want to start looking at the lips. And the lips actually are very similar to the eyes in the sense that they curve upwards towards the middle and have two very clear corners. So when looking at the top lip, we have the two corners of the mouth, then a curvature going towards the middle, then a little heart shape around the philtrum. And the same thing for the lower lip, but it should be a little bit more narrow than the top lip. The top lip always overlaps that lower lip. So if we see the lips from the side, we could see the top lip poking out and the bottom lip also poking out, and this means that the bottom of the top lip is almost always in shadow if the light's coming from the top, but the bottom lip is actually catching some light and actually has shadow below it. And this is quite important because this really helps with making the lips more realistic. Often, because the lips are a slightly different color, we can clearly see that different color. We tend to forget about the tones. But actually looking at the photo, the top lip is a lot darker than the lower lip. And so I'm going to use a darker tone for the top lip and try to fill in all the lines using that tone. And for the lower lip, I'm actually going to use a dark tone below it to indicate there's a shadow below that lip. And from there, it's just a matter of erasing any leftover lines. And this is one of those things that again can feel very unnatural in a way, because we like lines, we can understand lines, but in real life we don't actually see any lines, we only see tones. So often actually taking away those lines can make a drawing feel more realistic. Now, if you're working on the lips and like me, stuff is getting a little bit more muddled, what I tend to do is always go back to the basics of the two corners of the lip and the lip then going upwards towards the middle of the center line and the middle of the nose. And the fun thing is about knowing this structure is that you can then start seeing how everything connects this way. For instance, looking at the outline of the face, we can really see the curve of the brow and the eye socket, the curve of the cheekbones, and finally also the slight curve in the outline where the mouth is located, and then the slight line where the chin comes out. So working like this, you actually can understand what's going on in terms of the lines, and this really helps, of course, creating that portrait. So now finally I'm just going to add some highlights, and again, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments if you're watching this live. Now, as you can see, I've toned down the hair a little bit because generally she's got dark hair, so I'm using a darker tone for that. And then I can start adding a little bit of texture there. And I try to really hold back on this because of course I want the viewer to look at the features, not at the hair. So I try to artificially tone the hair down to make sure that the viewer doesn't spend too much time looking at the details there and instead gravitates towards the features where I want the viewer to look. And this concept is called focal point. Basically what I'm trying to do is diminish any details that I don't want the viewer to look at and enhance the detail and tone in the areas that I do want the viewer to look at. So for instance, around the shoulders, I'm keeping everything rather loose. And I'm going to start adding more detail in the areas of the face that I want the viewer to start looking and focusing on. And this is the part of the drawing that, at least for me, is the most fun because this is where we can get a little bit more creative. We've got all our structure in, we've got all our tones and shapes, and now we can start finishing. And at this point I like to also start using my compressed charcoal, just because it's a little bit more precise. The only thing about the compressed charcoal, and the reason why I don't use it from the start, is that it's hard to erase, so I need to make sure that I know that I'm not going to want to change where I put it. And what I'm going to focus on now is the outline of the shadows, the transition from those shadows into the light. And there are two types of shadows really. There's a form shadow and a cast shadow. And a form shadow is where one of the planes turns under. So for instance here in the jawline you can see that it slowly turns under, and this is a place where I can follow the line of that form with my compressed charcoal and then gently blend this in. And the softness to the edge of the shadow indicates that the shadow turns round. The same thing for instance here on the chin. I can follow the curvature of that chin and then blend it in. Now the shadow below the neck and just above the chin are both cast shadows, and these are shadows that are created by another object casting a shadow. In the case of the neck, it's actually the head casting a shadow on top of the neck, and in the case of the top of the chin, it's the shadow of the lips, casting a little cast shadow on the top of the chin there. And the main difference between a form shadow and a cast shadow is that a form shadow should always be soft, and in fact the rounder the object the softer, whereas a cast shadow is always nice and sharp. Now if the light is coming from the top, most of the form shadows will be turning upwards and most of the cast shadows will be at the bottom. So for instance, looking at the lips now, I can first outline the outline of the lip and then I can start blending it. And again, this can feel very counterintuitive, but if I now blend it, you can see how much more realistic that starts to feel. And this is because I'm basically showing to the viewer that this slowly turns round. And again, even if we don't see this, we know it if it isn't quite there. So again, another way that drawing can be a little bit counterintuitive. We see shapes and we want to put in the lines and the shapes, but actually sometimes losing some of these shapes can really help make the drawing feel more realistic. Now using my rubber, I'm just going to add some of the smaller highlights I see, trying to look at where the planes turn, for instance here in the philtrum, or near the side of the bottom lip, and this should bring a little bit more focus to that area. And I really love this way of working because it's very similar to painting. And it's also very forgiving. If I make a mistake, I can just brush it together using my blending tool and try again. And slowly I'm just sort of getting to a place where the lips are starting to feel nice and realistic and nice and soft. Now the same thing with the nose, and a lot of people tell me that the nostrils are very tempting to put in, but the reason why I don't normally put in a dark accent for the nostril is that they're actually not very important in terms of the focal point. So instead what I try to do is emphasize the corner of the nose going into the shadow. Because as you can see, if I really darken the inside of that nostril, it brings too much focus to that area of the portrait, and that's not actually where we want the viewer to look. Now, just like in the lips, the form shadow will be the top of the shadow and the cast shadow will be the bottom. And so I'm following the form using my compressed charcoal for the top, and I'm keeping the bottom nice and sharp. And I'm just using a hog brush here for blending. Another funny thing about drawing is that the softer the brush, actually the harsher the marks. I'm using quite a stiff brush here. And a hog brush is actually made of pig hair, so it's a very stiff brush. And this actually helps soften the charcoal into the paper. Now the same thing with the eyes. I'm just outlining my shapes, making sure that I don't lose them. And then I'm going to start blending them into each other. And again, the form shadow will be the top of the lid here, where it turns under, whereas the bottom will be nice and sharp. Same thing for the brow. I can see it's a bit sharper near the bottom of the brow and a bit softer near the top, where the hair starts slowly sort of dissolving into the forehead. I like to use my rubber here to just indicate some of the hairs. But again, not too much because I don't want too much focus there. But I like to follow the form again with my rubber because this helps indicate that sense of 3D form. Now if you're brave enough to blend, you may see how much loosing and softening can really help with making the picture seem realistic. And again, this is very counterintuitive, so if you're not quite comfortable doing so, only do a little bit in some places and see how it can completely transform your picture. So we're almost at the end of the pose here, so I'm just going to finish off the other eye. And in the meantime, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Alright, so that's the end of today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you've enjoyed drawing this portrait and learning about the structure of the face, as well as how tones can help you see a more realistic portrait. Now, if you'd like to show us your work, feel free to use the photograph button right here in the chat, or otherwise use the hashtag #RawUmberLive if you use Instagram.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.